Somalia has been the site of 20 years of war and state collapse, but it's also been the site of 20 years or more of conflict over competing humanitarian, political, and security objectives. I broke those down into three. Following Sarah, I wanted to stress that the definition of stabilization in Somalia is in fact slippery. I like to break it down into two different components, as Sarah has done, and that is the state building objective, that transformational approach to address the underlying political crises that are believed to be producing the humanitarian crisis, but then also the security, counterinsurgency or counterterrorism objectives that are at play as well. I've had a chance over the course of my career since the late 1980s in Somalia to work directly with humanitarian actors on humanitarian relief, in state building, and with the U.S. Army Peacekeeping Institute. And one of the things that has struck me over this 20-year period is how, in fact, how dramatically different the discourses are. Sarah just did a superb job of summing up these lines of reasoning, so I don't want to repeat it in too much detail. But the point that I want to raise is all three have very compelling narratives and are in a position to, with some justification, take some moral high ground in their discourse. For humanitarian workers, the objective of intervening to save lives is paramount, and nothing should get in the way of that, and nothing should get in the way of the basic principles that safeguard that humanitarian access. For those who are advancing state building, it's again a very powerful argument that their task is to address the underlying causes of the crisis in this society, that all else is essentially a band-aid, and that everything needs to fall behind them in this ambitious and challenging mission to revive central states and make them more functional and accountable to their people. And then for the counterinsurgency, military security folks, the imperative of going after groups that are, particularly in the post 9/11 era, directly linked to Al-Qaeda, is self-evident as the highest priority, and nothing may get in the way of that critical national and global security agenda. Now, one of the things that's a bit disconcerting, though, is when you have a position the way that I have accidentally ended up having in my career, where you're moving around with all three of these groups, is how little they're talking to one another and how dismissive they are of one another when they're in their own corners. And I think one of the big problems in this is just getting those three constituencies to start to respect the very important objectives and principles that they have, as opposed to what too often we've heard lately, especially with regard to the humanitarian community, is just dismissing it as naive, as band-aids, and not taking seriously the very important mission and objectives that they have. And this really gets to the nub of Sarah's point about the integrated approach, the 3 C's, the 3 D's, the push that we've had both in the UN system and in our own governments for a whole of government approach. And it begs a very important question. Whose objective is going to be prioritized? Whose is going to be subsumed towards someone else's end? And I think the anxiety that the humanitarian community is facing is very much that their objectives, their work, has been harnessed, has been subsumed toward either state building or counterinsurgency at great cost to their own mission. If I could spend just a few minutes summing up the current situation in Somalia. Many of you already know it well, but for the benefit of those of you who don't, Somalia has had no functional central government now for 20 years, and it has been the site of periodic but chronic humanitarian emergency. So we have had routinized humanitarian response in the country now since 1988, arguably even earlier if you go back to the Ogaden War in the 1970s. We have a transitional federal government that was established in 2004. It was so weak in the first years of its existence that it had trouble even establishing physical presence inside the country, and as a result was not taken at all seriously by humanitarian actors nor by security actors who continued to partner with local non-state allies in an attempt to capture high-value East Africa Al-Qaeda cell operatives in the country. The TFG, since 2007, since the Ethiopian intervention in Somalia, in its very brief war against the Islamic Courts Union, and then its military occupation of the country for 2 years, the transitional federal government became, at that point, a central pillar in international policy. Rather than simply look at it as yet another instance of a stillborn government in Somalia, a lot of energy and effort was put behind state building, making sure that the TFG was the only game in town, that it would succeed, both for reasons of long-term development and peace in the country, but also counterinsurgency and counterterrorism. That has not succeeded. The TFG, as of today, is in its 7th year now, or 6th year rather, of a 5-year transitional period. It has achieved no transitional tasks of any consequence. It governs almost no territory in the country. It's protected by 6,000 African Union peacekeeping forces in a few neighborhoods of Mogadishu. It continues to be bedeviled by internal splits and by levels of corruption and frankly by a lack of political will. This is not a government that is willing but unable to govern. In that instance, conventional state building assistance is appropriate. This is a government that is both unable and unwilling. Its top leaders, the people surrounding some of the top leaders, see it as a short-term money-making venture, and they've done quite well with it. So they have every interest in state building as a project, but they're not necessarily interested in state building as an accomplished objective. That has been the source of enormous frustration on the part of the international community, but up until very recently, it remained the only game in town, and there was enormous pressure for everyone to fall behind and provide support to the TFG. Very much as Sarah said, that included humanitarian aid. There were a lot of pressure on humanitarian actors to work through the transitional federal government in order to strengthen its legitimacy in the eyes of the Somali people. Meanwhile, much of the rest of the country was and remains under the control of a radical Islamist group known as Shabab, which in the past few years has increased its, at least rhetorically and in some ways actually operationally, its links to Al-Qaeda. That earned Shabab designation by the US government as a terrorist group in March of 2008. The problem, both before and after it was designated a terrorist organization, was that almost any operations in South Central Somalia had to deal with Shabab. And so international actors, humanitarian actors in particular, really had no choice but to do the same thing that they've been doing for 20 years in Somalia, and that is you work with whatever authorities you find locally. Sometimes they're rather pleasant and legitimate, sometimes they're warlords, sometimes they're jihadists. But if you want humanitarian access, you have to get there. And this was the third problem in Somalia, and that is the war between Ethiopia and first the Islamic Courts Union, and then Ethiopia's forces and the Shabab, which regrouped as the main insurgency against Ethiopia, produced horrific, a really catastrophic humanitarian crisis in Somalia. Somalia by 2007 was, by all accounts, the worst humanitarian crisis in the world. 700,000 people out of a population of 1.3 million people in Mogadishu fled the city because of the intense shelling and fighting. 3.5 million people were in need of urgent emergency assistance throughout the country, and most of those people were in Shabab-controlled areas. This was a major problem then for the international community, because on the one hand, we were channeling aid to try to get to people in need, and were concerned that some of that assistance was benefiting Shabab, and it almost certainly was. And this is a truism across Somalia. You cannot control the indirect benefits of any resource that's introduced into the country armed groups of all types will benefit. They're not foolish. I mean, it's a country of scarce resources. You're introducing scarce resources. They're going to do what they can to find ways to benefit. At the same time, we're trying to shore up the transitional federal government, which is actively attacking some of the aid convoys that are getting into areas they consider enemy territory. And all of this is occurring in a context of ongoing war. And this was the heart of the problem in Somalia starting in 2007. The transitional federal government, closely allied with Ethiopia, was at war with Shabab. It was therefore not a neutral party. And the Secretary General's special representative insistence that all humanitarian aid be channeled through the transitional federal government essentially meant you must forfeit your neutrality. You must take sides here. You must back the transitional federal government. This was a security nightmare for humanitarian agencies. It meant that they were going to be perceived as parties to a war. They were backing one side. In fact, Somalia was, by 2008, the most dangerous place in the world for humanitarian workers. 1/3 of all humanitarian casualties worldwide occurred in Somalia in that year, and they were being hit by all sides. That was the real tragedy for the humanitarian aid workers. Sometimes the attacks were coming from the TFG, sometimes from Shabab, sometimes no one even knew, but they were very heavy and intense. So this was the most politicized environment imaginable for humanitarian agencies in the biggest humanitarian crisis in the world. This gets worse in 2008 when the US government designates Shabab a terrorist organization. Why? Because now there is a legal dimension to the problem that is going to seize up the humanitarian aid community. In short, what it means is any benefit, any introduction of resources of any type that provide benefit to a group designated as terrorist puts the organization and any American citizens in that organization at risk of legal action by the US government. Since the US Agency for International Development was one of the main sources of food aid that WFP and others were distributing in southern Somalia, in Shabab-controlled areas, this meant that there was an internal problem in the US government as well. And USAID officials began to worry about their own liability. They sought out their own lawyers to look into it. This was done at a time during the transition in the Obama administration where there was no USAID director appointed yet. The word on the street is when there's no director, the lawyers sometimes can take over, for better or for worse. The legal decision that was rendered is that in fact they would be liable, and there were no circumstances that justified that. That was later upheld in a separate case by the Supreme Court, which very narrowly ruled on this issue of humanitarian aid versus the Patriot Act. So, in short, what we end up with then is the U.S. government suspending aid into humanitarian aid into southern Somalia, pressure on World Food Program to suspend aid, and an impasse as we entered into 2009 as a result. The fear was that we had 3.5 million people in the interior of the country who had grown quite dependent on food aid. And make no mistake, this is one of the criticisms that has been leveled at humanitarian actors in Somalia, is that their short-term work has had long-term negative implications in terms of the level of dependency that so many in Somalia have on the food aid. And so there was worry that this could produce, this could tip the scales from a humanitarian emergency to outright famine. Luckily, that didn't happen in 2009. What we've got in Somalia, what we've had is some fortunate good rains in the interim. We have a very large Somali diaspora, 1.5 million people living abroad who send money and who stepped up despite the global economic crisis to send a lot more money to the IDP camps. And so these, and also Somalis have, to their credit, they have extraordinary coping mechanisms. These are people that who have a long history of knowing how to get food off of the land, but they are, there is real concern that they have exhausted their coping mechanisms and are now very vulnerable to a catastrophic humanitarian crisis. when I look back at this episode over the past few years and the competing objectives, the insistence on state building as the highest priority coming from the UN SRSG, the insistence on counterinsurgency agenda of squeezing Shabab financially by suspending food aid into the area, and then the humanitarian community's insistence that they have an imperative to gain access to these populations in need. I see strengths of argument on all sides, and I see plenty of hypocrisy and weakness. But in the end, ethically, it seems to me that we need to confront this directly, and that is to say, if these three objectives in Somalia or Afghanistan or anywhere else find themselves in need of prioritization, that we can talk about whole of government, but the fact is one of these objectives is going to gain ascent and the others are going to be harnessed to that end. Okay, let's say we have to prioritize them, and we acknowledge that trade-offs are unavoidable in this whole of government or integrated approach. It begs the question, how confident are we in the likely success of the objective that we've prioritized? And in the case of Somalia, the objective that was prioritized, which was strengthening the transitional federal government, never looked like it was very likely to occur. Many of us had severe doubts about the viability of this transitional government. Its legitimacy was highly questioned by Somalis since 2004. Its leadership has been weak. There's been all kinds of warning signs that this transitional federal government was unlikely to succeed. That really, from an ethical point of view, is problematic, because it suggests that what we've done is we've tethered humanitarian access to a sinking ship. And so we've ended up in Somalia with nothing. Right now, of the three objectives, let me rephrase it. If this were a matter of having to live with a trade-off, and we're only going to get one of these three things, humanitarian access, state building, or counterinsurgency, then at least you could live with, well, we got 1 out of 3, or we got 2 out of 3, but we've got nothing in Somalia. Somalia is as dangerous in terms of jihadist insurgency as it's ever been. A lot of our actions have inadvertently strengthened the organization. Our efforts at state building have failed at fairly significant cost. And in fact, at this point, I think if you accept the premise that I argued earlier, that this is a government that is both unable and unwilling to govern, our continued unconditional provision of assistance to that government is actually creating moral hazard. It's incentivizing, it's rewarding the very behavior that is at the root of the problem in the first place. And meanwhile, in the midst of all that carnage, we've had almost no humanitarian access to the population in need. And so my final point, in terms of this very difficult calculation as to how you weigh these different agendas against one another, I would say that though the problem, of course, in the U.S. government is that this is a strictly legal affair. The Patriot Act is quite clear. Any benefit accruing to a group designated as terrorist is a violation of the act. And so there's very little wiggle room. But if there were wiggle room, if there were ways to, and there certainly could be ways if the political will existed in the U.S. government to address this in Somalia, it would raise another nuanced question, and that is, can we say with any confidence how decisive is the funds that Shabab, or the resources that Shabab benefits from in terms of humanitarian aid flowing into areas that it controls? Is it decisive? Where does Shabab get its funding? If in fact it's not decisive, if in fact it's only a relatively small part of the total Shabab budget, then I think we've actually got a fairly strong case to be made that we need to go ahead and re-engage there, provide access, if in fact Shabab wants the humanitarian aid agencies there. And that's the other twist in all of this, is there are some units in Shabab that have been very willing to cooperate with humanitarian aid agencies. There are others that accuse them of being spies, that accuse them of all kinds of things, that don't want them there. But presuming that they do want them there, if the case can be made that the aid diverted is not decisive in the struggle between Shabab and the TFG and external counterinsurgency operations, then I think it's very difficult to justify continued suspension of aid there. I'll stop there. I hope I didn't go on too long. I have no feedback loop from you all, so I'm not sure if I spent too much time. Sorry.
No, that was great, Ken. Thank you very much indeed. And I'm sure it's raised a lot of